My name is Jim Kaufman and I'm from the University of York, and I'm delighted to host this session today. Focusing on democratic ownership solutions, we will hear from an expert panel who will reflect on what it would look like to have economic institutions that worked to reduce inequality and create a more democratic economy. Each speaker is going to have around 10 minutes to make some introductory remarks, and then we will open up for discussion. We'll initially have around 10 or 15 minutes of discussion between the panelists, and then around 2:45, I'll bring in some of the questions from you, our audience. So first we have Christine Berry. Christine Berry is an author and researcher based in Manchester and has been described as one of the central figures in New Left economics.
Hi, yeah, super happy to be here because I've been living and breathing this theme for quite some years now. It's the subject of my upcoming book, which I obviously have to plug with Verso Books, which will be out at some point when I finish it. And I really think it's in line with the festival theme, rediscover, reimagine, rebuild, because I really believe if we're going to rebuild our economy to one that is based on social justice and equality, we need to reimagine ownership. So I'm going to say just a little bit about why I think ownership matters, why we need to democratize ownership, and what democratic ownership does and doesn't look like. So firstly, why does ownership matter? Two key reasons for me. Ownership matters because it confers power. Firstly, power to decide on things that shape our lives and things that matter to us. And secondly, power to exploit people who rely on access to the thing that you happen to own. And the key thing for me in understanding why current ownership patterns are a problem, why they need to change, is that it's not just who owns things that matters, it's the form of ownership and the logic that it embodies. And the dominant forms of ownership in the UK at the moment, I would argue, prioritize rent extraction, i.e. your ability to economically exploit your asset, and in particular to exploit people who happen to need access to your asset, over meeting human needs. And I think this simple fact explains a lot of what is wrong with the UK economy right now, in the way that it concentrates extreme wealth and power in a small number of hands and in a small number of parts of the country. It explains why life is so bloody hard for so many people, because the things that we rely on to live are so expensive. We talk about the cost of living crisis. There's a reason why living is so expensive in this country. And it's because things like childcare, energy, public transport, housing, we rely on for our access to all of these things. A small number of kind of gatekeepers who happen to own things, the most obvious example being energy. And I think Chris is going to give you chapter and verse on those things in a minute, so I'm not going to say too much more about that. But the key thing for me is extreme wealth, not just in this country, but in the global economy, is not a reward for hard work or entrepreneurship by and large. It's the rewards of ownership. So if you look at, I don't know, someone like the Glazer family, the owners of Manchester United, or if you look at Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, we can argue about how they've got the wealth that they've got, and some people would argue that that represents entrepreneurship. But by and large, it's not income that's made them wealthy, it's their ownership of assets. So in the case of Bezos and Musk, it's their ownership of shares in the companies that they founded that have happened to soar astronomically in value and make them astronomically wealthy. And the final thing I want to say about that is that this isn't new. We often talk about these things as if they are a new phenomenon, and I really don't think they are. If we look at the history of colonialism and imperialism, we can see that capitalism has always had this kind of what I would call, Brett Christophers calls, a rentier dynamic. People getting wealthy by owning things, and in the past by expropriating land and people from other parts of the world. And that also helps us to understand a lot of the global and racial wealth disparities that we see in the economy today. So what can we do about it? We can do all kinds of things to try and fix these problems after the fact, to try and redistribute the wealth. We can use tax, competition policy, regulation, and I think all of those things have their place. But for me, ultimately, if you want to shift the power dynamics, remembering what I said at the start, that ownership really matters because it's about power. If we want to shift the way the economy works and where power lies in the economy, we need to democratize ownership itself. So then what does democratic ownership mean? Again, for me, importantly, it's not just about who owns the stuff, it's about the logic that's embodied in that form of ownership. And I think Martin's going to talk a little bit more about historic approaches, different approaches that have been taken to how we might democratize ownership. So I just want to say a bit about what it means for me and some of the thinking I've been doing for my book on this, because I think democratic ownership can be used to cover quite a multitude of sins and quite a lot of different types of ownership, some of which for me are democratic ownership and some of which aren't necessarily. So, you know, historically, often in progressive circles in this country, if we're talking about democratic ownership, we're maybe either talking about state ownership or about worker ownership. And I think state ownership can be democratic or it can not be democratic. So, for example, sovereign wealth funds are a means that a lot of states use to basically invest via the capital markets. So the form of ownership is the same, right, as as if any other investor was investing via capital markets. They own stocks and shares in companies, property, bonds. Singapore's sovereign wealth fund used to own a big stake in a company called ABC Childcare in Australia, which was a rapacious shareholder-owned company, grew to a massive size, collapsed at catastrophic cost to families across Australia who lost their childcare. Singapore's sovereign wealth fund now owns quite a lot of student housing in the UK. And obviously it owns that because it wants to extract a rental income from it, not because it cares about the students. So I think that's a really clear example of it. That is state ownership, but for me, it's not democratic ownership. Again, worker ownership, may or may not be democratic depending on the industry. So if we look at the commanding heights of the UK economy today, things like banking, pharmaceuticals, oil majors, a lot of those actually rely on exploiting, so in the case of banks, exploiting borrowers, in the case of pharmaceutical companies, exploiting people who need access to medicines, and often again, a catastrophic consequence to people in the global south who can't afford the monopoly prices that they charge. Oil majors rely on exploiting the environment. So if we imagine, just as a thought experiment, a version of the UK economy where all of these companies were worker-owned, it might be better than the economy we have right now, but it certainly wouldn't be a kind of just equal democratic utopia, right? And a final example, which, when people talk about democratic ownership, often they talk about shareholder democracy. And I actually used to work for a charity called Share Action, whose whole deal was kind of trying to help us to gain more democratic control over the investments that we own through our pension funds. But again, I think this has real limitations because, again, the form of ownership is usually through that kind of same logic. And just an example that's popped across my radar really recently, I went into one of my local shops to buy gift shop to buy some cards, and they had a petition saying this precinct is going to be demolished at the end of the year. We've all just been given notice to quit. Please sign the petition to try and stop this from happening. And I said, well, who's the landowner? They said, Greater Manchester Pension Fund. No, and so people in the local community will have all kinds of views about whether or not that precinct should be redeveloped. But for me, the issue there is, should it really be Greater Manchester Pension Fund, whose duty is to its savers and to maximise the rental value of that asset, to decide what happens to that precinct? Or should it be down to the local community to decide what happens to that precinct? So for me, what democratic ownership means is that an asset or a resource is managed on behalf of those with a stake in a participatory way and with the aim of meeting needs rather than extracting rent. And I think I haven't got long left, so I just want to give one example, maybe two examples that are inspiring me right now about what that might look like. So a couple of months ago, I spoke to some people from an organisation called Kindling Trust, which is local to me in Manchester. They've been running a series of projects for many years, trying to basically democratise the food supply chain, so veg box schemes and things like this. And they've just bought a community farm, and they've got a community share offer, which I think may still be open. If it is, it's closing soon, so check it out, Kindling Trust. They've bought a community farm in Knowsley, which is going to be run as a multi-stakeholder cooperative, like in the interests of people farming the land, the consumers who want a better deal on buying their food, and the planet, ecologically sustainable farming, none of which the current food system serves very well, right? And what I think is interesting about this is, of course, those people won't always have identical interests, right? The interests of farmers in getting a decent price for their produce might be in conflict with the interests of consumers in getting cheap food. But the idea that they are kind of asserting, which I think is really, really important and valuable, is that those conflicts should be addressed democratically within this kind of democratic container, rather than via markets which are skewed towards the interests of people who happen to own assets, and increasingly towards the rich and powerful. The second thing that I think is really inspiring about this is something that this woman, Helen, one of the founders, said when I spoke to her about it. I said to her, you know, do you think that individual projects like this can really shift a huge juggernaut like the global food system? You know, what have you learned from your years and years of getting to this point of buying a community farm about that? And, you know, my head was in agricultural land prices and regulation and all these systemic things I thought she was going to talk about. And she didn't talk to me about any of that. What she said was, but, you know, sometimes I feel really despairing and I feel like, you know, can we really change it? And then I think to myself, what else would I be doing with my life? There's nothing else that I want. This is what I want to be doing. And these are the people that I want to be doing it with. And I just found that so inspiring, because I think these democratic ownership solutions, they offer us a glimpse of a different way of living, a different way of relating to each other, to the land, to the planet, and a different idea of what a good life and a good economy might look like. And that for me is why we really need to talk about ownership.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Christine. And thanks for keeping to time so precisely. That was pretty impressive. So our next speaker is Martin O'Neill. So Martin is a professor of political philosophy at the University of York, and he is going to have a look at some of the, or draw out some lessons, historical lessons for democratic ownership that we might take forward. So Martin.
Fantastic. Thanks very much indeed, Jim. And it's a great pleasure to be following Christine. And I think hopefully my remarks today will really sort of fit in with a lot of what Christine had to say as well. So I want to talk about some of the, well, in particular, a couple of suggestions from the history of social democratic thought, really, where people in the past have thought about ways that you could form what I think of as collective capital institutions, that you could think about elements within an economy that would allow the collective ownership of important parts of the economy and would thereby help to create a kind of overall economic system that did much better in various ways than the one we have, given that the one we have obviously has some of the kind of extractive and anti-democratic features that Christine has been talking about. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about the values that I think are at stake here when we think about the case for more forms of collective capital ownership. I'll talk then a little bit about two examples, James Mead and Rudolf Meidner, and I would say a little bit about why this kind of approach of thinking about ownership more is in some ways much more promising than some of the other suggestions I think that often get discussed when we think about the possibility of more radical economic policies, especially basic income, which I think has become one of the dominant options in recent years, but that has certain kinds of problems. And then I'll just say a little bit about the idea of how some of these institutions might fit together. Okay, so I think there's sort of two structural problems that we need to think about addressing. So one is the problem of inequality with regard to wealth and income, and that's something that Christine talked about, and something that we increasingly see as a problem within our economies, especially the way that large levels of economic inequality turn into inequalities of power and influence, and turn into inequalities of opportunity in the next generation. So that's one issue. And another is just directly about the maldistribution of power and control, the sense that although we live in societies that are notionally democratic, really there's enormous concentrations of decision-making power within the economy, which is to do with the underlying structure of ownership. So in Thomas Piketty's influential book, from, I guess we're coming up to its 10th anniversary, there was a very sort of striking case made for how over time returns to capital are likely to grow within the economy relative to returns to labour, and that we're really heading towards a sort of dynamic where increasingly economic rewards are flowing to existing holdings of wealth rather than being to do with sort of the contribution that people are making through work. And if you think about increasing automation, the rise of AI and so on, that's only likely to increase over time. So I think we need to think about institutional strategies that allow us to avoid a sort of dystopia where a small group of very wealthy capital owners are able to extract more and more rent, if you like, from the economy, and where we end up with increasingly opportunities, power, influence, all sort of attaching to quite a small section of society. And we're not going to be able to get there just by thinking about redistributive mechanisms. You know, there's no plausible approach dependent just on the tax system or on transfer payments that's going to address this. You've got to think about underlying patterns of ownership. So it's got to be about pre-distribution and not just redistribution. So two people that I want to talk about from who've sort of grappled with this idea. One is this chap, James Mead, who was a British Nobel Prize winning economist, who wrote a wonderful short book that I'd recommend to everyone in 1964 on efficiency, equality, and the ownership of property. And he talked about the limits of the redistributive welfare state. He was writing at a time where inequality was much less advanced than it is now. But he thought what you needed to do was to think about how the state democratically could get into the business of capital ownership. So he was a sort of early theorist of sovereign wealth funds, but he was interested in the way that they might be used more democratically, how those sorts of sovereign wealth funds could be used to fund sort of forms of local investment, could be used to kind of capitalize investment that was being sort of undertaken in different parts of the economy, and where that could to some degree be under the control of people democratically, and where you thought about sort of the investment function within the economy, not just something that happens in the private domain, but where you think about bringing more of that into the matter of democratic control. So I won't go very much into detail here because I know time is short, but it's very instructive, I think, if one thinks about the different approaches taken to the returns from North Sea oil by the UK and Norway. The UK, of course, used that to largely to fund tax cuts. It was done at the same time as the giveaway of council housing, whereas the Norwegians set up a large sort of democratically controlled, albeit quite centralised, I suppose, but nevertheless a sovereign wealth fund there in the interest of the Norwegian people, and that, I think, history might show was a much wiser strategy than the one that was adopted in the UK. But another proposal from a sort of earlier era of people grappling with these sorts of ideas comes from the Swedish economist Rudolf Meidner. So Rudolf Meidner was interested in the way in which the Swedish economy, even though in some ways it was very egalitarian, was still concentrating control very much within a small number of hands, and was still really not distributing the rewards to economic activity as well as it might do. And he came up with what gets called the Meidner plan, which involves turning every large private firm into a new kind of institution through the slow partial collectivization of ownership and control. Every firm would pay a small levy every year into a fund that would then levy in terms of its own sort of capital holding, its own stock, into a fund that would be controlled by the workers in that fund, which would give them both a mechanism for exercising control over that firm, and would also give them a mechanism of getting some of the returns to capital from that firm, and thereby sharing capital returns more broadly. So this was seen by Meidner as exactly a kind of institutional response that through the very same policy tried to address both problems of inequality and problems of a lack of democracy and a lack of control. So it seems to me that if one thinks about forms of collective sovereign wealth that could be deployed and controlled maybe at local level, and could be used for different sorts of democratic purposes. And if we thought about the kind of transformation of the firm that Meidner suggests, you start to get an idea of what a sort of ecosystem would look like there, that created an economy that was much better at distributing economic returns in a more equal way and distributing power and control in a more equal way. And here's a couple of reasons why I think this is a much more promising approach than the kinds of ideas that we see around basic income. So the idea of universal basic income that's got a lot of attention really in recent years is in some ways a very highly individualistic idea, and coming at exactly a point where we need to think about collective action and collective solutions to lots of problems, especially around the climate emergency. Universal basic income, it doesn't create new sites of democratic power, and it doesn't do all that much to change the underlying power dynamic of the economy. If you think, for example, about the existing distribution of ownership of homes in the UK, and then you introduce quite a generous basic income into that structure, what you would very likely see is just a huge amount of the flow of basic income would end up in the pockets of landlords, who would then be able to increase rents. It wouldn't really change that power dynamic, for example, between landlords and renters, and it wouldn't change lots of the other kinds of extractive power dynamics within the economy. And basic income would also be highly vulnerable to forms of erosion or reversal. So one thing about trying to find ways to rewire the ownership structure of the economy is that really gives you an opportunity to create stable forms of change that would bed in over time. Whereas approaches that really just depend on flows of redistribution within a particular period without changing that underlying ownership structure are going to be very politically vulnerable. They're not going to have the sorts of deep roots that a move towards a change in ownership would do. So I think one of the sort of the issues for us to sort of consider is how some of these collective capital institutions might fit together. What would it look like to have a more egalitarian and more democratic economy that had a kind of ecosystem of different sorts of collective capital institutions that work together in order to create an economy that did more to equalize returns and did more to distribute power and control in a more democratic way. So I think that's about trying to think about how elements of that network could be mutually reinforcing and can help to build their own support over time. So I think, when thinking about these sorts of ideas for kind of institutional innovation within the economy, it's very important to think about which sorts of changes in ownership, which sorts of institutional innovations could actually start to kind of accelerate their effects over time and build more support for a different kind of economic settlement. But it seems to me that that kind of going back and considering some of these different options gives us a way of thinking about what the elements of a system like that might look like. So I'll leave it at that. There's some references for various things I've written for anyone who might be interested, and I will now hand over to Jim and to Chris.
Brilliant. Thanks, Martin. So next, as advertised, we have Mathew Lawrence. Unfortunately, Mathew can't make it today, but we're joined by his colleague, Chris Hayes. And Chris Hayes is an economist and data analyst at Commonwealth. Over to you, Chris.
Hi there, and thank you so much for having me last notice, and thank you again to Christine and Martin for some really fascinating talks. In particular, I really want to pick up on a lot of the themes that Christine was outlining earlier regarding her critique of models like worker ownership and shareholder democracy, where you can imagine under those scenarios a lot of the same sort of exploitative and rent-seeking logics could still carry on, and that the question to a large degree is not just a question of who owns it, but how they own the key assets in society. So I want to talk a bit, I want to pick up on those themes and talk a bit about how the current economic moment is actually an extremely acutely poignant time to be exploring these themes, because not just because we're in a crisis that has huge distributive components, but also because it's becoming increasingly clear that the economy globally is entering an era where we have real concrete objectives, such as security in climate, in food, in the provision of basic social goods, and also in geopolitics, as opposed to fairly abstract objectives like growth, and even abstract objectives like equality per se. And I want to talk about how we can achieve, how democratic ownership institutions are a way of achieving those concrete objectives and sort of steering us through the crisis. Because again, as Christine said, it's very much a matter of decision-making power, and therefore public ownership can be a way of not just allowing everyone to share in the social economic surplus, but also providing a way of achieving these objectives. And I also want to explore the idea of whereby public ownership and decommodification therefore has not just a humanitarian aim, but an institutional aim, by cutting off these cycles of asset price speculation, whereby the business cycle is increasingly driven by capital gains. So I think as a way of drawing this out, I want to talk about the current crisis, starting as it did with basically a commodity shock in energy markets, which through our institutions of fragmented, marketized rent-seeking private market coordination has allowed an initial commodity shock to be to metastasize into a huge chronic crisis, like a Rube Goldberg machine with the sort of chain reactions of dysfunction. So obviously the commodity shock means that you have this big spike in the price of these of gas, and that allows has a hugely distributive component in the sense that you've got surging profits, most of which are then cashing out in shareholder payouts in the form of dividends and buybacks. But also you're seeing a growing distributive crisis, not just between labor and capital, but also between different segments within capital. So the swelling margins on the part of energy companies and other commodity firms, real estate companies who, as Christine said, achieve those profits by their ownership of these scarce strategic assets. The flip side of that is not just lower real income for the rest of us, but also squeezed margins on the part of other companies within the economy, and very often those squeezed companies are the industries that actually employ the majority of the workforce. And some of our work has therefore shown how shareholder payouts within the FTSE 350 have skyrocketed while labor compensation has remained largely flat. And given that this is both a distributive crisis and a climate crisis, it's worth realizing that in the case of large oil companies like BP and Shell, the amount of cash that they've forked back to shareholders has outnumbered their investment in renewable energy capacity by 10 to 1 in the case of BP and 6 to 1 in the case of Shell. And these companies are now pivoting back to fossil fuel exploitation and away from renewables as they realize the profit opportunities there. So what we have there is clearly a case of upward redistribution, but at the same time as they're thwarting our shared climate goals, so that these two things are being thwarted in one fell swoop. And naturally, there's another sense in which people often claim that the main beneficiaries of these shareholder payouts are largely ordinary pensioners. But as our work has shown, in fact, private pension wealth is twice as unequal in the UK as labour income. So you have a situation, therefore, where the main beneficiaries of this distributive crisis are the already wealthy, and yet the forms of social security that people are reliant on, largely through private pension wealth, is nonetheless imbricated in the system of exploitation. So it becomes increasingly difficult to come up with policy remedies that don't in some way like have some sort of fallout on the owners on people who rely on those income streams. At the same time, the net zero transition is like relying upon private capital and relying on the investment risk return logic that goes with it, which has been disastrous with public subsidies being plowed to private capital in return for very limited investment. And the upshot of all of this, I guess, is worth underscoring, which is that from a single commodity spike in gas that is then metastasizing to overall energy prices for the rest of us, including non-gas energy, which is every bit as cheap as ever in fact, cheaper than ever to produce, is nonetheless being sold on wholesale markets at a price that is determined by gas. And then you have, on the one hand, squeezed real incomes, squeezed investment capital for those private companies that have to pay for energy rather than sell it, leads to these further spillover effects in the form of both slowing growth and high inflation, which can only be which the current set of policy instruments among the Bank of England has to combat by raising interest rates, which in turn raise mortgage rates, which in turn raise the rents on housing for the rest of us who are reliant on renting from largely buy-to-let landlords. So with all of that kind of laid out in a somewhat haphazard way, I just want to underscore again the idea that democratic public ownership is a way of basically slicing this very, very dense, tangled Gordian knot and making sure that the provision of housing and security in old age can instead contain financial spillover from achieving these things, rather than every collapse in house prices turning into a larger financial crisis. At the same way, we need to think of utilities provision as a way of steering through the carbon transition. And we can do that without having to suffer all of the trade-offs with that. In a scenario of private ownership, for example, scaling up renewables needs to be coordinated with scaling up the national grid, which needs to be coordinated with the scaling down of fossil fuels. It needs to be coordinated with the potential fallout in the labor markets among oil and gas workers, and it needs to be coordinated with the building up of skills in net zero. So once again, I'll just leave it there, but highlight the idea that democratic ownership is a way of steering us through the poly crisis rather than allowing us to just blindly ricochet through it. And with that, I'll leave it there and we can go to questions, I think.
Super. Thanks very much, Chris. And thank you to all of our excellent speakers. So we now have some time for discussion. I think I'll open it up to the panel and they can respond or pick up things that each other have mentioned. And then a little around 1:45, I will pick up some of the questions in the Q&A box. So maybe just to start things off, thanks all three of you. You all offered really compelling arguments for democratic ownership and control of different aspects of the economy. So Christine, you pointed out the need for greater democratic mediation of the problems that we face, and mediating between different needs and interests. And Martin, you also spoke of the need for sites of democratic participation and infrastructures of equality. And Chris, you pointed to how greater democratization is going to be vital in addressing the collective problems we face, in particular navigating the climate crisis. So there was lots of agreement among the panel, and I'm going to throw out an attempt maybe to see if there are any kind of differences between like how you approach this. which is to think just in terms of, so there's a really compelling case for the need for greater democratization, but I wondered about your thoughts for getting us there, right? So Martin, your vision of different infrastructures, that's quite, it's quite ambitious, this whole ecosystem. But I was wondering, for each of you, do you have an idea about the kind of key targets or candidates for expanding democracy and kind of moving it out into different spheres? So are there particular kind of candidate areas or industries or areas of social practice and ownership where we should focus our energies, and why? And maybe we could go back to Christine.
It sucks having to go first because you get no time to think.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is the $1 million question, right? I mean, as Chris said, it's a Gordian knot, and this is actually something I've really grappled with in writing my book. It is a bit of a catch-22 that kind of we're arguing the reason that we need to democratize ownership is because we have this extreme concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a small, number of asset owners. But the very fact that that power is so concentrated, the nature of the problem that we're trying to solve, makes that problem can often seem very intractable, right? So confronting and challenging those interests is really difficult, but partly because, as Chris said, increasingly ordinary people's interests are implicated and bound up in that system, through pensions or through home ownership, through what some people call asset-based welfare. The idea that we depend on asset ownership for our economic security. Even if we're only getting a few crumbs from the table, it makes it harder to disrupt the system. And also just because those interests are so politically powerful. And I think we see that with the strategy of the current Labour leadership as compared to the previous one. They've clearly taken a view that it's not politically feasible for them to go into an election promising to confront those interests. I actually think that there is a lot of political scope to draw a wedge, as Chris was doing, right, between the kind of mass of genuinely entrepreneurial, productive kind of industry that is contributing to the economy versus the sort of oligarchic rent extraction that is undermining the stability of the rest of the economy. And I think, even within the constraints the current Labour leadership are operating under, you saw them try and do that a little bit with the windfall tax pledge on energy companies. And I think politically that works because people can see very clearly that the gains that are being experienced in one part of the economy by energy firms, because it just so happens that oil and gas prices have risen massively, not through anything that they've done or any innovation or work on their part. Firstly, they can see that it's unearned, and secondly, they can see really clearly that it's matched 1-for-1 by an increase in cost that's being paid for by somebody else in the economy. So it's purely extractive, and that's really obvious to us all because we're paying for it on our energy bills, right? So I think just from a purely political point of view, sectors like that, where the politics it's very obvious to see how it works. And I think care for me is another one. Care is the one that when I've been writing about it for my book, like every time I talk about it or think about it or write about it, it makes me so mad because there's just no justification for organising the ownership of care homes and childcare the way that we do in this country, right? And everyone knows about the collapse of Four Seasons, or all of these care home chains that often very over leveraged, very unstable, no way to run a basic service. And also everyone's got a relative or knows somebody in a care home. They can see, again, very tangibly, they can see how it's not working for care workers, it's not working for the people that need care. So that would probably be my other pick, and I've probably spoken for long enough, so I'll stop there.
I mean, I agree with everything that Christine said there. I think the sort of internal relation between the values that we're worried about here and the thought that certain forms of inequality in wealth, inequalities in power transmute into kind of political inequalities, and that part of what makes it so hard to kind of reform a system where you get that kind of reinforcing pattern between kind of economic and political inequality. Part of what makes that so difficult is precisely that, once the system beds in and kind of send more power, more control to one particular kind of group, it gets harder and harder to shift away from that. So I think, you know, in the remarks that all three of us have sort of gone through today, that there's something of a diagnosis there of like why this is so difficult and what those sorts of internal relations are. And I think, you know, as Christine says, once you make very clear to people the forms of extraction that we're all paying for, whether that's through our home utility bills, or whether it's through care costs with childcare or care for our older relatives, it's very palpable in people's lives exactly how these forms of extraction are disadvantaging us all, and how a different kind of institutional setup could do better. And I think, you know, one starts to see this in lots of different places around the world, in you know, the kinds of suggestions being made by a range of different political parties all over the place. And the fact that we might be in a particularly cautious moment in British politics, you know, should not, you know, sort of put us off from thinking about these ideas, because I think it's very clear that it's only sort of structural solutions that will actually deliver the kinds of changes that would be needed. And that, you know, none of these are going to go away. And as Chris says, with the kind of environmental crisis in the background, it's just going to get more and more stark, the evidence of the fact that we need to have these kinds of large changes in the structure of the economic system. So I'll stop at that.
Yeah, I mean, at the level of, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think at the level of political rhetoric, it's very much a question of, you know, who benefits and who suffers. And, you know, for that reason, I think something like housing would be a much more intractable case, because it's the actual benefits of that are flowing to a much more widely distributed like demographic, and people will be extremely reluctant to sort of give up those gains, or give up the possibility of those gains, even if if those people haven't enjoyed them yet. But in the case of a lot of utilities, such as water or energy, or you know, social utilities, as Christine points out, like care is obviously a brilliant example of some. These are things that everyone needs, or everyone you know, knows people who need. And the cases where the beneficiaries are an extremely narrow group of very opaque, like often like private equity firms, who are sort of creaming up the top and neglecting the services themselves. I think, as we can see in the polling data, people do want to see a resolution to that, and are very amenable to questions of public ownership there. And especially where the utilities concerned are like inputs into the economic process, stuff that, if priced too expensively, will hold back other forms of industry, then there's actually some quite easy wins to be made there. If energy were to be like entirely nationalized and then provided at cost, that would be a huge economic boon to everyone except the current owners of energy. So I think there's definitely some easy, quick wins and some like non-reformist reforms to be made there, if the political will is there.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm now going to turn to some of the questions that have appeared in the Q&A box. We've had loads of really good questions, so I don't think we'll manage to get through all of them, but I've selected a few at random, and I think I will read out two, and then it's up to our speakers can respond to both of them, or whichever one kind of they speaks to them. So the first question is from Lauren Peel. So Lauren was responding, Christine, to your introductory remarks. So Lauren does some work with credit unions who are member-owned non-profit organisations, and they do excellent work but struggle to attract new members as they're competing with organisations with much bigger budgets. Have you got any examples of how community-owned organisation is competing effectively against commercial organizations? So a question about some examples. And then we also have a question from Phil Baby. So Phil asks, I guess there's a question of scale. So Phil's question is about scale and ownership. At what scale is a community, and at what scale does democracy live? For example, how do different situations point toward community group ownership or council ownership, and what happens when these two are in conflict? So it's a question about how you make democracy work at different scales.
Shall I come in on the second one, maybe? So I think that was Bixby who's very involved with the York co-owned community project that's looking at the future of the York Central site and how that can be made into a more democratic and a more egalitarian development. So I think the answer on scale is that there isn't one straightforward answer, and which I think goes a little bit to the kind of the ecosystem metaphor, right? That what we need is different kinds of public ownership, different kinds of collective ownership, different kinds of democratic institution operating at different levels. And there might well be cases where that doesn't fit together terribly neatly, or where there's some tension between the objectives of different kinds of organizations, but I think that's fine, right? That's just a kind of that's a much more productive tension than one where well, let me put it this way: it shouldn't be something that leads us to think that there should only be one scale at which we think about ways to have a more democratized economy. And I think I've written various things about ideas of community wealth building, where you think about what can be done at the level of a city or a local authority in order to have a more democratic or a more equal economy. And that, I think, should be seen as something that can fit into a broader approach that's also thinking about Meidner type proposals on wage earner funds, or thinking about ways of having maybe regionally administered democratic sovereign wealth entities, or that also thinks about collective approaches to the ownership of energy. I think all of this is, it's really about thinking about how you can have a network of different kinds of institutions that could fit together. It might not be completely neat in that way, but I think that would be a kind of productive complexity, and it's worth pushing at all these different levels to think about all the different ways that you can deal with these questions of both of just economic rent extraction and the kind of inequality that follows from that, and the concentration of power and control that you get under the current institutional circumstances. So that's a sort of an answer that acknowledges the difficulty of the question, but says that that's something really that we can kind of live with.
Shall I go next? Maybe I'm going to start with an example that I think speaks to both of these questions, or both of these challenges, a little bit. So I'm sorry to keep going on about my book. It's just where all this stuff comes from for me. I'm not trying to plug myself. But there's a chapter on big tech, right, where I went into it thinking platform co-ops. I don't know if people have heard of the concept of platform co-ops, but they had sort of a vogue a few years ago. And the idea was, we're going to build cooperative alternatives to Amazon and Uber and Facebook and all the rest of it. And this is going to be like the sort of great democratic hope of democratizing ownership of tech. So I went into it thinking, this is what I'm going to write. I'm going to write about platform co-ops and how great they are. And I basically discovered that not a single one of them has so far managed to succeed, any of these platform co-ops, which is not to say, I mean, I think they're a brilliant idea, and I have a lot of affection for them as an idea, but I think there are two reasons why they've struggled so much to succeed. One is this issue of scale, that tech is a particular example where part of the reason that big tech has got so big is that there are network effects, right? Like Facebook has value because everyone else is on Facebook. Same with Uber. Whereas co-ops as an institutional form tend to struggle to scale, partly because of the system they're operating in and they find it hard to access capital, but also because there is a sense in which sometimes co-ops don't want to get too big, because the bigger you get, the harder democracy and cooperation becomes, and that's a challenge for those models, right? So I don't really have an answer to that. It was something that I've just genuinely really struggled with. in terms of kind of thinking about how, particularly when, you know, as Lauren said, like in a sector like banking, where you're trying to intervene in a market that is extremely concentrated and you're competing with these huge firms. But the solutions that you want to promote, by and large, are kind of small scale community. You know, you want to embed the principle of subsidiarity, I guess, and keep things as close as possible to the people with a stake in the activity, to keep power as distributed as possible. You know, as Martin said, you know, there's not one answer, and there are many different scales that we need, but I think in general there is a kind of bias towards subsidiarity, the idea that things should be taken, decisions should be taken at the lowest or the most distributed scale that they possibly can. Then I think you do have a challenge, and this is why I think there has to be a role for the state. And this is probably not really the answer that Lauren was hoping for. I can't off the top of my head think of a brilliant example of a community organization that has kind of successfully risen to dominate a market against these kind of much bigger commercial beasts. But I think there's a reason for that, and I think that's why ultimately you do need a state that is committed to a certain amount of leveling down, you know, whether it's using regulation or competition policy to break up some of these big concentrations of power so that the new shoots of democratic growth can thrive. So that would be my main answer. Just on the scale thing, I would also say, though, I think it's really important, especially for those of us in a kind of post-imperial global north economy like the UK, to really challenge ourselves and hold ourselves to account about those cases where the appropriate scale for democracy is bigger than the nation state, and, you know, where the entire planet has a stake in assets that might be owned in this country. I'm thinking particularly of things like intellectual property assets, for example, you know, where we have knowledge companies that own the intellectual property, just to take a random example, on a vaccine against COVID. You know, that the whole world has a stake in that being available as cheaply as possible. And so in that case, you know, the citizenry that you want to have a stake in that asset is global. And I think there are really inspiring examples like the flu network, for example, which is what comes up with, like, figures out the strains of flu that go into the flu vaccine every year, which is basically a kind of knowledge commons and open knowledge commons that operates globally. So I think often when we talk about things being global, people see it as a council of despair. They're like, oh, well, like, you know, realpolitik, like, that's just never going to work. It's not possible to have a global commons in these assets, but it is, because it already happens. There are already examples of where it's being done, and I think we need to think at that scale as well.
Yeah, I mean, I find that the question of scale is also, yeah, it's a difficult one, because I mean, in some cases, we've been talking about like big infrastructural questions. Then, like, there's it's difficult to localize decision making, other than insofar as people are sort of affected by it in different ways. But at the same time, everyone still has a collective stake in what it's delivering. But there's a question of what's being displaced. I think there's, when it comes to the ownership, like sort of cooperatives competing with people, that gets us to the question of what are the actual logic according to which they're doing that competition, and they're like, how are the different entities actually interacting with each other? Because if you've got a cooperative that's trying to compete with a privately owned one, the cooperative may have everyone sharing in the surplus, but at the same time, they're still, depending on how competitive that market is, they're still, the fact that they're competing with them means that the question of who wins is still determined by the same market logic. And the more competitive the market is, then the less room for maneuver those firms have to make different decisions about how their commodities are used. I think an interesting case study in that is also just the fact that fragmentation within markets means that you have smaller scale entities who are competing with each other, but that actually sort of creates a conflict between, like, living standards and competition. So there's a weird quirk of the energy markets, was that because it's the generators upstream who are creating the energy, who are enjoying all of the profits, and then the retail suppliers downstream who have the consumer relationship are actually who are purchasing that energy on our behalf and then selling it to us. those retailers are like extremely squeezed in terms of their margins, but some of those firms are like vertically integrated. So like Centrica, which owns British Gas, was making huge profits from their generation arm, but their retail arm was very squeezed. And at the corporate level, Centrica could have used some of that cash to provide relief to their customers, but anti-competition regulation prevented them from doing so. So that's a case in which I guess reducing scale is actually sort of like not an ideal case. So I guess, yeah, it just depends on very much case by case basis.
Thanks, Chris. So we've now reached the end of our allotted time for this webinar. Thanks again to our three really amazing speakers for some thought-provoking discussion and some really interesting food for thought. If you would like to purchase a copy of Mathew, Christine, or Martin's books, they will be available from the festival partner bookseller, boxlanebooks.co.uk.